Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're talking to a brand new guest. His name is Kurt Gray. He has written a book called Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. And so, Kurt, I've got a lot of questions. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Definitely. So before we get into the book, can you maybe take a few minutes just to tell us, about yourself, especially for people who are new to you and your work? Who are you? What do you do? Who is Kurt Gray? Tell us what we have to know.
Sure. So I'm a social psychologist. It means I'm really a moral psychologist.
Hmm.
So I study how people make moral decisions. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a pastor. I'm not going to tell you how you should make moral decisions. I study how people do make sense of the concept of right and wrong and
Hmm.
how that connects to politics. I grew up in the Texas of Canada, Calgary, Alberta,
Hmm.
and then have steadily moved my way further south. I'm now at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I direct the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding, trying to find ways to better understand and connect across divides.
I love it. How long have you been there at that school?
13 years.
13 years. Wow. So it's been a long time. Bet you have some stories teaching this kind of stuff.
Definitely has some stories. Almost all of them good.
That's awesome.
Almost all of them, positive. Students love it. People
Yep.
like connecting. They feel the need for connection. And so, yeah, I feel pretty good about this stuff.
I love it. So I wanted to have you on the show today because, in all honesty, I am looking for another way to be and to exist in the world. And I think that your book and your work is giving me at least a couple of pieces to this what feels like a very complicated puzzle. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about me real quick, and then I'm going to hand over the microphone to you. But I grew up in a very conservative evangelical world, which you obviously are familiar with. You wrote about it in your book a little bit. And in that world, I was taught to be angry and outraged at everything on the left, right? Like Obama is the Antichrist and pro-choicers are the baby killers and the LGBTQ community is out to harm our children, all these different things. But then I began to like deconstruct and like rethink my faith, and I found myself moving over to the left, which was much more progressive in thought, but I soon began to realize, is in many ways just as angry, can be just as judgmental, just as outraged about many of the similar kind of things. And so I began to really realize that I was quickly becoming on the left the very thing that I thought I was trying to leave behind on the right. Like the energy was the same. I was just kind of directing it at a different candidate, a different set of values, beliefs, etc. And so somewhere around like midsummer, the election starts heating up, and my progressive and conservative friends on Facebook are also heating up, and something in me just kind of rose up inside and said, like, I can't do this anymore. Like there has to be another way to be, to exist in these times. And like maybe instead of just choosing sides and demonizing the other side, maybe there's a way for me to hold my progressive beliefs and my values in a way that I can recognize the humanity in other people, engage in some sort of helpful dialogue, and maybe we can work together to make the world better. And so I did some digging, I did some research, and I came across your book. And so I would love, first of all, if you have anything to respond to my story that I just shared, I'm all ears. And then secondly, if you could just kind of wade us into the waters of this book and talk about how maybe your book fits into discovering this other way to be in the world.
Well, first, thanks for sharing. And I think I'm grateful for, you and folks like you who are trying to understand the other side and trying to hold a kind of different space than just pick
Hmm.
a side and launch vitriol. I was just at a conference that I was organizing this weekend by the New Pluralists, and they're a group funded by folks on the left and the right who are trying to kind of create more understanding, more kind of ability to engage across differences in America. And
Hmm.
it's hard to do. And even people who are there, you can feel uneasy because there's so many ways we can be different from others, and there's always tensions.
Yep.
But I respect, the impulse, and I feel this deeply too, of finding the kind of common humanity we share. And it doesn't mean agreeing with the other side,
That's right.
but it does mean understanding that they're not evil. And sure, maybe there's like 1% of people out there who are evil, who are psychopaths. And maybe that's overrepresented in our politicians and people in
Mhm.
the media sphere. But like most people who vote differently than you and the same as you, right, are genuinely trying to do good. And what the book's about is genuinely trying to protect themselves and their family and society from harm.
Yeah. So the book details these three different myths that can keep us in a state of outrage. And I thought that was really interesting because once you debunk the myths, it kind of also lowers the level of outrage. And so I was wondering if you could maybe just take us, I obviously don't want to give away all the pearls of wisdom in the book, but if you could give us like a overarching explanation of these three myths and how they can kind of keep us locked up in that place of outrage.
Sure. And so I think maybe like the broader point to take home,
Hmm.
right? And then I kind of start the book is that we have a narrative in our minds when we think of the other side, and I call that the destruction narrative,
Hmm.
that the other side is evil, maybe stupid, but certainly evil, and they are, bent on destruction, like a superhero villain in a sense, right?
Yeah, that's
Like,
right.
right? You want to burn it all down.
Yep.
And you just think that like the other side cares for nothing except just chaos.
Mhm.
Um, but I think, the reason we think that is because, we hold these three myths. And if we dispel these myths, then what replaces this destruction narrative is what I call the protection narrative, which is more accurate. And that's where everyone's kind of motivated to protect themselves
Mhm.
and really, care for their society and their family. And so the three myths are, one's about how our mind works, one's about who we are deep down as people, and one's about how we should better bridge divides.
Mhm.
And so the, I mean, I guess the correct thing, the debunking of all the myths, is the same point, which is that we're all concerned about harm,
Yeah.
but it manifests in different ways. So I talk about the harms of the past, the ancient past sometimes, harms of the present, and then harms for a better future. And so the first myth is about human nature, right? The idea that we all evolved as apex predators, and it's not true, but that myth makes us think that the other side is like stalking us in the
Mhm.
darkness and they have it up. Like if other people, if we all evolved as predators, then like when someone does something bad or mean to you, then you think it's like they're motivated by like this steely, cold sense of, ruthlessness instead of just being terrified, right? And so
Yeah.
the answer to that myth is actually we're more prey than predator, and we
Mhm.
are mean, it's because we're terrified and feeling threatened.
We
Uh,
bite back, so to speak.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, right.
Mm.
And I'm happy to talk about any of these. I'm gonna, if it's useful, I'll just go through them all now. But like,
Yeah, I'll just go through them
yeah,
all, and then I have one specific question about one of them. But yeah. Mhm.
okay, perfect. So the second myth is about that there is moral concerns that are separate from harm, the kind of
Mm.
myth of the harmless wrong. And I think this is really interesting across the political divide because if you are, let's say you're a liberal, secular person and someone, conservative, evangelical, is like, oh, I'm against this, like the advance of gay rights, for instance.
Mhm.
Then to a liberal, you're like, well, you're clearly not worried about harm because gay people getting married is harmless. And so you must be a terrible person that's just like, I don't know, obeying the word of God because you're not thinking deeply about things. But in fact, if you look at everyone's moral judgments about every issue, ultimately they're grounded in kind of like intuitions of harm.
Mhm.
And so when we recognize this, then we can recognize that even folks on the other side, they're really concerned about protecting themselves, right? Not only do we evolve as prey and we feel like worried about, the threats that are out there, but also when we think about specific moral issues, we're worried about harm.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of second one, kind
Mhm.
of the myth of the harmless wrong. And in fact, everything's really about harm. And then the third myth is, well, how do you better connect across differences? We have this idea that the best way is like facts, right?
Yeah.
Just like impartial, cold facts we get from NPR or Fox News or CNN, whatever. And if I could just like throw enough facts at you, you'll change your mind.
Yeah.
It never works. You never come away from it, a conversation being like, "Oh my God, that one fact you had. Oh wow, I guess I give it my view on abortion or immigration, right?"
Right.
Like uncle, I give it up. And instead of like trying to win with facts, we should be trying to understand with stories about suffering. So personal experiences from your life for when you felt threatened or vulnerable, and how your political beliefs kind of grow out of that experience of harm. And
Sure.
so those are all kind of myths that all revolve around the fact that harm is not important or irrelevant, but in fact, the truth is that we have a harm-based moral mind.
Mm.
And if you understand that, you can understand the other side, whether it's about politics or arguments with your spouse or with other parents, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's all about
It
harm.
fits into all realms of life, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally, right? Every argument we have when it comes to morality is about like who's the real victim or who's really being harmed, right? Everything that we
Yeah.
argue about.
Yeah. The one that really hit me the most was the first myth because I feel like I feel like I see it so much at work in my own life and my own thinking, and I've seen it so much at work in my past. But like I feel like debunking that myth has like so much power to make a difference when it comes to having these conversations about morality and politics. Because I was thinking like I live in the South, and so there's lots of MAGA supporters and different things like that. And we have somebody up the street who's got he's got a big banner on his house with, Trump in a tank, shooting all these guns and stuff like that. And he's like all fired up about his politics and it's, ranting against all things woke and progressive and all the different things. But if I come into a conversation with someone like that, and I see them as coming from a place of offense, where he's just out to attack me. He's out to attack my family, my child. He wants to defeat me. Like I can already feel my inside shaking because that just brings up all these different kinds of feelings if I see myself as being attacked. But if I can look at someone like that who might see things drastically different than me, and I can see him coming from a defensive posture where he's not out to attack me, but he's out to protect maybe himself, maybe his kids, his future grandkids, maybe even those in society that he perceives to be the most vulnerable. I feel like it's so much easier to come into a conversation with someone like that and ask some curious questions as opposed to feeling like I have to jump back and attack as well. I feel like that can just settle down the emotions in the conversation and have actually maybe some sort of progress in the conversation.
Absolutely, right? The kind of intention and motivation behind someone's actions is so important to appreciate and really changes the entire situation, as you
Mm,
say, right? And the research really supports that idea. So if you look back through the mists of time, right, we've thought for a century about that humans are apex predators. But if you look back, through time, like we were mostly hunted.
mm,
We were, attacked by saber-toothed cats. Our kids were picked off by giant harpy eagles.
mm,
And luckily, we don't face that anymore. But we still have this kind of deep, deep sense that there's threats out there. I mean, it can be like, physical, even animal threats. Like if you strip down to your underwear and stand in the forest at dusk, you
mm.
don't feel like a predator, You're worried about every snapping twig. You walk down a dark alley, right? You're looking around. I don't like even if you're the buffest person around, you're still like, is there a danger lurking in the
Yeah.
darkness?
Mm,
And so we are really kind of like built to be afraid.
mm,
And right, with politics too, right? You're like listening to these narratives where people are like, this is terrible in our country. Like, we should be afraid of this and we should be afraid of this. We accept those fears that we listen to and we project them and we worry. And that's exactly right. That's what's underlying our behavior. Even when it seems like we're on offense, we're
yeah.
ultimately still on defense.
Yeah. And I noticed that because I was reading your book. I came across the book and the ideas of the book over the summer, like I said. I don't remember exactly where I saw it, but it got me thinking and looking at what I was receiving from the news, what I was receiving from social media. It got me looking at all of that through this outraged lens. And I was trying to look at some of these myths. And one of the things I saw was how easy it is for you think of like the two candidates. It was, I felt like everything that I was being told was trying to make me afraid of
Mm.
something, right? Like you had one side, the right side saying that, if Kamala gets in, there's going to be, these drugs on every corner, all these horrible things are going to happen. We're going to be like Venezuela, all these different things. But then on the other side, it was if he gets in, it's going to be like Nazi Germany, and like all these different things were like creating all these fears inside, and it almost felt like the goal was to win my allegiance by making me more afraid. Like whoever could make me more afraid is the one who is going to win my vote and win my allegiance. And I felt like growing up, I grew up in the church, like I said, and I felt like this was very familiar territory for me because I feel like growing up in the church, I was afraid of everything. Everything
Mm.
was going to bring me to hell, everything that was going to bring me away from God, and I had to stay away from this and stay away from that. And I'm like thinking to myself, I'm deconstructing my faith in a sense where I'm starting to realize that a lot of the things I've grown to believe over the course of my life have stemmed from something that I was afraid of. And I feel like I've learned to almost distrust that a little bit because the things that make me the most afraid are not necessarily the things that are the truest. And so I've started to realize that maybe I need to re-examine the way that I'm thinking about my politics as well.
I mean, good job. That's hard work, right?
Mm,
Because we're so powerfully motivated by threats and by fears.
yep.
It takes a lot to kind of put some distance between yourself and those fears. And it's especially hard because many people know, like, elites in the media, politicians, that those are the best buttons to push when it comes to motivating votes and motivating donations,
Yep.
um, getting people to sit in pews, maybe as well. If
Yep.
you think about, right? I mean, there's definitely like church leaders who don't lean on, feelings of fear and
Right.
feelings of threat, but it is effective. And so I think it's good, for everyday people to know. That's why I wrote the book, to know how powerful those threats and fears are and to know how our minds work so that we can do, in a sense, what you did, which is understand how it works and then put some kind of separation between those fears and your feelings and your actions.
Yeah, that's right. It's funny, I was looking back, playing Monday morning quarterback, but looking back when I was a pastor, I pastored this very small church. So there's maybe like 40 people. And I was getting a lot of pressure because it was a small congregation and the elder board wanted the giving to go up and all the different things. So we had all those conversations and all that pressure. And one of the big things that was pushed on me was to try to get me to talk more about hell and to
Hmm.
try to get me to talk about more about people's eternal destinations and get more people talking more about like when Jesus returns and the rapture and all these different things. And I can remember feeling very like I didn't want to talk about those things because I was wrestling in my mind about what I really believed about those things, but I also felt like, and I didn't have the words for it then, but I do now. I felt like it was very manipulative because I felt like a lot of the pressure was again to generate the fear in the pews that if I can get people feeling enough fear about hell, you're probably going to give a little bit more because you can play with the sermon, you can play with the service to like make those things happen. And I just felt like it was all very manipulative in a way. And now looking back on that through what I'm learning in your book, I could see how manipulative it really was, even if the people who were pressuring me weren't necessarily intending to be manipulative in their way.
Interesting. I mean, it's an interesting question too, right? Because if it's genuinely believed, and if those harms are really deeply felt,
Yeah.
then in some ways, I mean, perhaps it does motivate donations and motivate people to attend service, but also it's a moral imperative to do so.
Hmm.
And so I mentioned in the book, right, I had this story from when I was a kid visiting my conservative evangelical family in Nebraska. And I went to Sunday school. I was
Hmm.
like 10, and the lesson was about baptism. And we all went around the room, and kind of like talked a little bit about, it was clear I wasn't baptized as like the, secular kid from Canada
Right.
sitting in a church basement in Nebraska. And then the Sunday school teacher asked, does anyone know what happens to people who aren't baptized? And then a kid puts up his hand and she's like, yeah, Jimmy, whatever. And the kid says, yeah, they go to hell. And it felt like a setup,
Hmm.
right? Because here I was, the only kid who was clearly unbaptized. And then come to find out that, my grandparents and my aunt and uncle are they're like praying for me every night. And it felt a little bit like a setup, like
Hmm.
it pulling some like, prank on me. But then I realized that look, they legitimately believe in hell. They legitimately believe that like Satan's forces are marshaling,
Hmm.
and the only way to stand in the way of those forces of evil is baptism and accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior. And so they were ultimately trying to protect me
Yeah.
even if they were doing something that, in the moment was a little offensive. But so I think that it's tricky, right? I think that's the tricky balance. On one hand, you could be like, I know they're trying to motivate donations and
Yeah.
attendance. On the other hand, if it's genuinely believed, like perhaps they're ultimately trying to do good. And so
Mhm.
that's something that we can wrestle with.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the things I found interesting in the book, and you have a ton of research in this book, which I appreciated, and maybe you can share a little bit with us, but specifically around how people on the right and the left tend to view each other regarding certain topics versus how people on the right and left actually view those topics. And there was this one study that I thought was really interesting, but you said that there were like, I think 50% Democrats think that most people are bad, or most police are bad people, or Republicans said that. That's right. Republicans said that 50% of Democrats believe that police are bad people. And the reality is that the polls showed that 80% of Democrats would disagree with that. So, in other words, 80% of Democrats believe that most police are actually decent people trying to do their best to keep us safe. So, could you talk to us a little bit more about that, about how we often view the other side in ways that don't accurately reflect the other side's views and motives, and how that can even help diffuse some hot conversations if we can actually get an accurate picture of the other side?
You bet. So, one reason that we dislike people is
Hmm.
because we think they're bad people, we think they're evil, we think they're stupid, or we think that they dislike us, right? I feel like you're at a party and someone whispers, like, oh, that person hates your guts. Like you're going to dislike them. You're like, what have I done? Oh, I hate that person now too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the deepest human impulse is to
Hmm.
like, reciprocate someone's feelings towards you and to react against, when you think that someone thinks something bad. And so we think that the other side is evil,
Hmm.
right? Like one study that we ran suggests that people, Democrats think that 15% of Republicans think that child pornography is acceptable and vice versa. That's insane.
Hmm.
The number's zero. The
Yeah.
number, like, no one thinks that this is acceptable. Or like embezzlement or infidelity. You're like, yeah, my side thinks it's wrong, but like their side, I don't know. You
It's like
know?
99% of them think it's all right.
Yeah, exactly. And we also like totally misrepresent like who the other side is. So another study I really like shows that Democrats think that I don't know something like 20 or 30% of Republicans or something make like above $250,000. Like they're all super rich, and Republicans think that like 20% of Democrats identify as like LGBTQA kind of stuff, and like those numbers are way smaller, right? Like we
Hmm.
just caricature the other side in a way that, fits our stereotypes. But when you actually see the other side accurately, which is namely that like they basically like you,
Yep.
they have a strong moral compass, and they don't hate you. We like overestimate by like 300% sometimes how much the other side dislikes us.
Mm.
And when you find out, you're like, actually, the other side doesn't really hate you. They don't hate the police. They don't hate, gay people as much as you think, right? Everyone's just like understands you're trying to get along and they're trying to get along. Turns out you appreciate that fact. It's much easier to have conversations and to not demonize the other side.
Mm. So, like, $1 million question then is like, how do you go about receiving a more accurate, other than asking the other person, but like, how can you educate yourself, inform yourself on what the other side truly believes? Because like if you go to typical news sources, God forbid you go to social media, right? Like you're just getting this firestorm of ideas, and it's so hard sometimes to separate what's fact, what's fiction, what's even a little bit real, what's not. Like, where do you go in order to learn more about maybe someone else, like the other side that sees things differently than you?
Great question. Right. So don't go to cable news. And don't go to social media, like you said, because the loudest voices are are what's being amplified by those
That's right.
algorithms, and the loudest voices are the most aggressive.
Hmm.
In fact, we have a study that shows if you unfollow the most loudest divisive voices, like your mental health is much better
Hmm.
in the long run. And so I think you actually kind of hit on it about asking questions to people who you disagree with. And it's hard, but like that's the way to do it. And that's what people want to do because they want to have relationships with their uncle. Like I don't know how it is with your family after you left the church, right?
Mhm.
But there's still a kind of the desire for many people to just like, I want to have a connection with my family. I want to have a connection with my friends who maybe I disagree with.
Yeah.
And so if you can find a way to sit down, have a beer with someone, right? And there's other news sources you can go to, some more thoughtful news sources you can go to try to like really get like they're wonky, right? If you go to like think tanks, like I'm not saying everyone should go to like, oh, these think tanks that lean left or right,
Yeah.
but they're actually pretty reasonable, right? And you can see their policy goals. Um, but I think if you don't want to read reports from Washington think tanks, I think you can just like talk to people who you know are good people, but who you
Yeah.
disagree with, right? Like my landscaper, the dude who runs that business, like he's certainly more conservative than I am. We
Hmm.
chat about kids, we chat about the election a little bit. Like you got to dance around it a little bit,
Yeah.
right? But I'm still glad we have these conversations. So asking questions is a great way.
Yeah. I have a friend who's been on the podcast before, and he's an author. He's a, pretty big name in like the more progressive church arena. But we were talking about similar ideas around religion, even politics. Like I said to him, how do you talk to people who disagree with you? And he said one of my best lines, which I think fits really well with your book, he said, is when someone gives me this idea that I just think is outrageous, like in my head, I'm going, oh my goodness, I can't believe this person thinks this. He says, I'll say, wow, like I see that entirely differently than you do. Can you help me understand a little bit more about why you think the way that you do? And he said, typically, he said, if the other person just wants to attack, he said, they're not going to want to talk. So they just go off on another topic. But he said, 9 times out of 10, if that person really wants to engage, he goes, it kind of disarms them a little bit. And he says, they're going to tell you why they think what they think. He said, and they might even ask you what you think differently, why you think differently. And it could lead to a much deeper conversation as opposed to I'm just going to pull from my random Bible verses or my random news sources and I'm going to hit you with all this information. Like you said, facts don't always change people's minds. And so when you approach it from that angle, it really kind of disarms the conversation and actually get somewhere, which I think is great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I make the point in the book as well, right? That this desire, this motivation to understand, making your intention known goes so far.
Yeah.
And, you know, I end the book with a bunch of like concrete tips that people can use to kind of like get into these conversations better. But the best one, I think, is just trying to understand and using that word in a conversation, help me understand,
Yeah.
is so powerful, right? Like
Exactly.
I talk about sometimes how I had an Uber ride with a Christian nationalist.
Mm.
And, you know, he asks me, he's like, what do you do? I'm a professor. What do you study? In politics and morality. And he's like, oh, all right. Like, hold my beer, right? Here's
Right.
what I
Let me
think.
pull over. Right?
Basically. So he's like, I'm a Christian nationalist, but not the typical kind. And I could have, because most of the folks I know are much more progressive, just been like, oh, that's weird. I'm going to shut down.
Yeah.
But, you know, I genuinely want to understand about people with different views. You know, this is what I study. And so I say, oh, interesting. Like I've never met a atypical Christian nationalist before. Maybe you can kind of tell me what you think and why you think this way. Help me understand. 20 minutes telling me all about his views, right? What he thinks of the church, the state, the family, all sorts of things. I learned a lot. I asked a lot of follow-up questions. But here's the interesting thing is that when we were getting to the airport, we started talking about abortion,
Mm.
obviously contentious. And he says, look, I'm pro-life, and so I think anyone who's like pro-choice, I sometimes I think about them like, kind of like the Nazis, like they're just like willing to like, be Gestapo. And I teach a class on this, and I talk about that in the book too. And I say, look, I teach a class on this about how to have reasonable conversations, civil conversations about difficult topics. You can't compare someone to the Nazis, right? We're having well-meaning, you know, conversations. We're all trying to understand each other. Like you just can't call someone Hitler. And what he does, which surprised me and surprises many folks when I tell them, is that he says, you know what? I'm sorry. I
Mm.
got a little heated, right? I just meant that like if you like disregard the sanctity of life in this instance, then you like might do it in others. It's a slippery slope argument. It's a philosophical argument. You can make that argument. And but I was so surprised and happy that he said, I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to take that back and I apologize. And then
Mm.
we left that conversation kind of like seeing more eye to eye, at least like that we're both human beings and we're really trying to understand how the world is and do our best for our family and our society, right?
That's
And
right.
that never would have happened, that apology and that stepping back without me trying to understand where he was coming from
That's
for
right.
like 20 minutes, right? So I think
That's right.
understanding really does create this kind of like mutual sense of respect where you can feel, able to kind of like take a step back, take a pause, maybe apologize because you feel heard and seen.
Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, it takes more time to do that, right? I mean, it's much easier to just fight. It's much easier to, oh, you're gonna say that to me, so you're gonna say that you know, I'm, I'm like a Nazi, so I'm gonna come right back at you. Well, what about your side and what you believe with this? It's so much easier to go back and forth like that than it is to take that deep breath and try to hear somebody out and then ask, like you said, a follow-up question. Because so many times when even when somebody's feeling the pressure of having to put their thoughts on the spot, they don't always explain them maybe the way that they intended to. So to ask that follow-up question, like, you said this, help me understand a little bit more about that. It just makes the other person feel like you actually want to hear them. And I think that that just paves the way, like you said, for then you to be able to come in and share your thoughts. And I think it's just such a more difficult way to do it, but I think it's such a more um, you get a lot further in the long run.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think you feel better, right?
Yes.
I mean, like
Right.
you don't carry around this hate, this outrage in you if you can understand that the other side. I mean, you can still be convicted to your beliefs,
Sure. Sure.
but you can understand that like, they're real human beings. And
Yep.
like I also talk to a lot of, churches and faith leaders. And what I really like about, the best of churches is like the concept of grace.
Mm.
You're having this conversation, you give someone a little bit of grace. They're going to say something that offends you.
Yep.
It's going to be hard for them to do it. But you just like, you take that beat and you understand that they're like trying their best and you're trying to make sense of it. And I think it goes such a long way.
That's right. So how do you deal with like the criticism behind this work? Because the other day I mentioned I told you before I hit record, but I mentioned on social media that I was reading this book, and I mentioned that the book talks about these myths and kind of correcting our perspective on them to find common ground and talk to people. And so I proceeded to I got one email from somebody who is actually a PhD scholar in religion. And he said that I'm a special kind of vile for wanting to find common ground with the enemy. I got another comment on Facebook, I think it was, saying that you can't find common ground with Nazis. There's that word Nazi again.
Always. Yeah.
But then I got an email from somebody, which was actually a more thought-provoking email with some pushback. But the pushback basically was, they said finding common ground with somebody who is against LGBTQ inclusion, women's rights, etc., might be easier for you to entertain because you're a white straight male and don't feel as attacked as maybe somebody else might. And then I had a couple people withdraw their Patreon support. So clearly the
Oh,
book
wow.
struck a little bit of a nerve.
Oh,
And so
wow.
my question is like, how do you, if you, I'm assuming you've encountered it, but how do you respond to that kind of feedback, that kind of critique? Like feedback where people are almost like demanding that you take a side, like demanding, like, or almost like outraged that like we could be in these times that we're in, and how could you possibly not, take this firm stand and not demonize the other side and not see things like I do? Like, how do you explain to people that like, hey, I still have my values, I still have my beliefs, my ideals I feel very strongly about, but I'm trying to find another way to hold those things. Like, what do those kind of conversations look like?
They're tough. They're tough for sure. And, I've had been on podcasts where folks on the right kind of accuse me of, being an apologist for the left and like, aren't they Nazis, right? So everyone's comparing other people to the Nazis.
Yeah.
Um, it's a bad place to be in society.
Right.
Um, but I think there's actually a number of replies to this concern. So
Mhm.
one is that I'm not giving up my political convictions. I am taking a side. I do vote, I do donate to
Yep.
political causes, probably as much as anyone who's like unwilling to talk to folks on the other side. But I think one, our country is a pluralistic country e unum pluribus.
Mhm.
I'm not a Latin scholar, right? But but like, we are a country forged in differences. And honestly, I think our country is best when there is differences, maybe not as different and as hateful as we are today,
Mhm.
but like there's a word for countries where there's only one party and everyone ostensibly has the same belief, and that's a dictatorship, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to live in communist China, right? I don't want to live in a dictatorship. I want to live where there's like reasonable disagreement.
Yeah.
Two, I think, look, if you're progressive and you're upset that you lost, I think that's a very fair feeling.
Mhm.
But if you want to affect change, then you, even just pragmatically, you need to engage with the people who have the power.
Yeah.
And you need to engage with people to build coalitions, right? To build allies, right? Like these are the ways that you can do it by conversation. And I work with lots of organizations that are actively finding ways to find common ground so that they can pass bills that everyone agrees in,
Mhm.
right? There's so much more agreement out there than we think,
Yep.
even about abortion, immigration. Like there's a striking amount of actually what we agree on.
Yep.
And so if we can work together and have conversations about those areas we all agree and pass bills to make that happen, then society is better off,
Mhm.
right? Society is better off. I mean, maybe I'll make an analogy to like, look, let's say you're having a disagreement with your partner, right? Like your husband or wife, and you're just like so angry at them. Like you could just be like, we're blowing up our marriage. We're done. Like this thing that you did, it pissed me off so much. We're done. And sometimes that's reasonable, but like you can't get divorced in America today. Like we are stuck with the other side, right? So you need to
Yep.
figure out a way to like live with them. Even if you're not happy, right? You still need to find a way to like take care of your kids and like do the house maintenance, right? So I feel like
Yep.
this is where we're at.
Yep.
And I guess the last thing I'll say is like
Mhm.
there are people, to get back to your question about like, well, as a white man, there's a certain amount of privilege. Like there are people who feel so strongly about this that they're willing to like, let me just tell you the story. Daryl Davis, a black man, a blues musician, cares so much about the kind of common humanity in America and seeing the humanness in others that he has befriended hundreds of KKK members
Mhm.
and gotten them to hang up their robes. Like there's pictures of him standing with like, a guy with like a hood in his full KKK regalia. And like, should someone have to do that? No. Is it better for the country that he's like de-radicalizing these people? Probably, you know? And so I think if we can all kind of understand each other and like bring people in from the fringes,
Yep.
then I think we can move forward better as a country. And so I
Yep.
totally understand the criticism. And when there's a battle, there's war, it feels like betrayal to understand the other side. But like, I
Yep.
don't want to be in a war. I want to be in civil conversation with someone who disagrees with me so that we can find common ground and move ahead.
That's right. Yeah, I read a quote. I think it was I think it was Marianne Williamson, but she was saying that, real lasting change that's going to impact everybody at a societal level, it's going to be very hard to bring that change on the heels of an angry generation who just wants to demonize the other side. Like there has to be some level of communication. There has to be some level of taking down those boundaries or those walls and being able to have those conversations. So what I said to that one person who, that was the most thoughtful critique that I had received. And what I said to her was, I actually wouldn't disagree with you, that it's probably much easier for me as a straight white male to look in the eyes of someone who is, against gay people, who is against women's rights, all these different things. But I said, I feel like because it is a little bit easier for me, I have a responsibility to follow through on that level of ease and be able to try to have a conversation where I can understand that other person, whereas it might be more difficult for someone who is gay, for someone who is a woman to be able to have those kind of conversations. I feel like I almost owe it to myself and I almost owe it to, the world around me at large to have those, to try to engage in those conversations at whatever level I can.
Yeah. And also I think, the other side is not, homogeneous. I think the other side, there's like wide variation, right? So there's people
Yeah.
who might decide that like your position is actually the right position if you
Yeah.
engage in enough conversation and understand. Like you pivoted from a conservative evangelical Christian, tradition to something more progressive. And if you're progressive, right,
Yeah.
then you could think that there's people out there, and the way to get them to think about things is by talking with them and understanding them and not demonizing them.
That's right.
And so I'm not saying you need to like, I don't know, random example, right? You don't need to sit down and like bare your soul to Tucker Carlson.
Right.
Right? But
Yeah,
there
right.
are people out there who want to talk and who want to understand,
That's
and there's
right.
many more people who you think, right? And so the success of like the civil rights movement or women's suffrage, right? Those happen because those movements found allies and people who were like, closer to their movement than others, and they could kind of like leverage that kind of desire to understand in those folks, right? So I
That's right.
think social change happens when we have this kind of dialogue and when we strive for understanding, because then people understand us.
That's right. That's right. So last question for you. You talk in the book about a group called you call them the exhausted majority, which is, I think it's 65 or 67% of Americans kind of belong in this group. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the exhausted majority is, because I suspect that many of our listeners, myself included, might fall into this category, and some of the practical ways that people in the exhausted majority can put the findings of your book into practice.
Sure. So going back to the previous point about why you don't go on social media or cable news to learn about the other side,
Hmm.
right? It's because the people who get elevated by algorithms and the television are people who are the angriest and the most outraged.
Yeah.
But it turns out that most of us are not these people,
Mhm.
right? As you say, 65% of people, they're exhausted. They just want their country to work. They just want, to get raises. They want their kids to be happy. They want healthcare to work on the left and the right.
Yeah.
And so recognizing that most people are like this hopefully means that we're more willing to have conversations with people, because it turns out the person you're talking to isn't like a politician that wants to like totally change the government. They're just someone who wants like cheaper gas
Yeah.
or less expensive groceries or wants their kids to go to community college, whatever, right? Like you just want something that works and that helps you and your society. And so I think if you recognize this, you're more open for these conversations. And then I think when you're approaching folks for these conversations, there's like some specific tips in the book, but again, I think the first step is just trying to understand, right? If you approach these conversations with a desire to win, then you've already lost,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know? And
Mhm.
so don't approach these conversations as like a chance like, oh, I'm gonna own this person, as if you're like on some YouTube channel where like, haha, everyone's gonna see that I'm
Gotcha.
right and like
Right.
you're stupid.
Yeah.
But like that, it's never gonna work. Like think of
Yeah.
this more as like I don't know, you're like meeting a family or a date. I think like if you think of this more like a date, you're gonna ask polite questions, see where coming. You're not gonna like, I'm gonna own this date. They're gonna know how smart I am.
Right.
That'd be a terrible date.
It's gonna
Or
be
I'm just
your
gonna yell
last
at them the
date.
whole time.
Right.
You know? Also a terrible date. But if you're
Right.
like asking them questions and being polite and be like, oh yeah, this is interesting. Do you want to get another drink and some nachos? Like it's gonna go a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that a lot. Well, Kurt, hey, we're just about out of time, but this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you, appreciate your work, appreciate your book. Thank you for making time for us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And real quick, where can people go if they want to interact a little bit more with you and your work? Anywhere you want to direct us to?
Sure. So the book website is outragedbook.com,
Hmm.
and there's lots of free giveaways that people, reader resources. So there's lots of cool stuff there. I've got a Substack, Moral Understanding newsletter people can follow, and I'm on LinkedIn if people want to add me there.
Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes and maybe we can do it again sometime.
Great. Thanks so much.
Awesome.